What if I tell you that consumers like you and me now pay 80% of the total taxes collected by the center and all state governments put together? On the other side, producers, and here it is almost overwhelmingly going to be companies in the organized sector who pay taxes, they pay the remaining amount, which works out to roughly about 20%. What do I mean when I say we, the consumers, are paying 80% of all taxes that are being collected right now? Here is how I have calculated it. As most of you know that there are two kinds of taxes, direct and indirect taxes. Direct taxes are those which are collected directly from us. They are levied on our incomes or on our property. We pay it directly to the government, or it is directly deducted by employers and paid to the government. The direct tax that we know most often is, of course, income tax and corporate tax on companies. But there's also capital gains tax, there's property tax, and so on. These are all direct taxes. Indirect taxes, on the other hand, are baked into the price of the things that we buy. And as the name suggests, they are indirectly levied on us. Someone else collects it and pays it on our behalf. And most often, we don't even see how much we are paying, right? The most important indirect tax right now is, of course, the goods and services tax, GST. And more often than not, our bill doesn't even tell us how much of the final amount we paid was GST. That will go into the government's coffers. Now, if you go and buy a car, you might look at it and say how much of it was GST. There's a lot of talk about that right now. But you're definitely not going to do that when you're buying a packet of biscuits or the shampoo. It's not even going to show up in your local store's bill. There are other indirect taxes, including excise duty, which is now restricted mostly to petrol, diesel, and other fuels, and it is levied by states on alcohol. Then there's customs duty, or taxes that are charged on imported goods. When it comes to direct taxes, we pay income tax and most of the capital gains tax, I mean household consumers. Corporates pay corporate tax and a part of capital gains tax. When it comes to indirect taxes, almost all of GST is passed on to us and becomes part of the final price we pay. Similarly, excise duty is also passed on to consumers like us. Customs duty is a little different. Some studies have shown that corporates sometimes absorb a lot of it when it comes on machines or raw materials that they have imported. But customs duties on things that we directly buy, such as foreign cars, is passed on entirely to us. So here's how it looks. Let's look at this. We consumers pay income tax, all of GST, all of excise duty, and a small part of customs duty. Corporates, on the other side, pay corporate tax, a small amount of GST which they absorb, and a big part of the customs duty. So, to simplify matters, what I'm going to do is, I will assume that we pay income tax, all of GST and excise duty, but I'll take customs entirely out of our bracket. While corporates, we will say, pay corporate tax and all of customs duty. This might be an approximation, but it is good enough to make estimates and especially to compare across time. So add all these up, and as I said right at the beginning, we consumers now pay 80% of this total and corporates or producers pay just 20%. However, if I rewind just 15 years, this ratio was very different. Taxes on consumers were less than 2/3, roughly 65% of the total tax collections of the center and of all states put together. And the remaining 35% was being paid by corporates or producers. So 65, 35, that was the breakup. In 15 years, the burden on us has risen from 65% to 80%, to whopping 80%. And here, this graph will tell you how it happened. And look at this graph now. This one is the exact reverse of what has happened to corporates. Their burden steadily went down in the past 15 years. Now, let us put both the trends on the same graph so that you can compare and contrast. See how we households, ordinary consumers, have ended up bearing a much higher share of the total tax collections of the country. Just look at this. And mind you, a large chunk of this is paid by us, the middle class who's caught in the middle. We pay the largest chunk of income tax and we pay the lion's share of GST and other indirect taxes because we buy the goods which have the highest GST on them. But before I go on further, here's an appeal. The reason why the Quint is able to focus on news and issues that matter to you, news and issues like this, is also because of you, especially those of you who are our members, part of the wider Quint family. We all know newsrooms can only speak the truth on behalf of the people if they are independent. And running independent newsrooms costs a lot of money. This is where you can contribute by becoming our members. It's easy. Scan the QR code that is on your screen right now and choose one membership plan. Your help will keep us going. And I promise, we promise that we will use every paise to speak truth to power. Okay, back to our story about how we consumers now have a much heavier tax burden to bear. Now one can argue, and it's a good argument, that if you tax producers less, it will increase their post-tax profits, and that will be good because they will have an incentive to invest more. That will mean increased production, greater economic growth, more jobs, and higher salaries for people. Of course, none of this has happened in the past decade or so. The exact opposite has happened. The investment rate is down, there are fewer good jobs, and salaries are stuck where they used to be for more than a decade now. But that's an entirely different story. We will unpack that in another video, another day. Now, I guess it would also have been okay that the burden of taxes shifted on to us consumers if the total taxes collected had dropped. Here, let me explain this by using a hypothetical example. Imagine that 100 crore had been collected as total taxes in 2010. As I said, back then consumers paid 65%. So in this hypothetical scenario, we would pay 65 crore. Now imagine that the total tax collected dropped to 80 crore in 2025. Even though we are now paying 80% of that, the actual amount we are paying is 64 crore. So corporates would have definitely gained, but consumers wouldn't really have been affected either. In fact, we would have come out a little better. And as I said, one can argue that this is good. Lesser taxes on producers gives them an incentive to invest more, and that means more economic growth, more jobs, and higher income for everyone. That's good, right? But again, as we know, the opposite has happened. If we look at the total tax collected by the center and states and compare to the nominal GDP in every year, right? Here is how it looks. Total tax as a share of GDP has actually risen steadily, except for a dip during the COVID lockdown. You can see that on the graph. It used to be about 16% of GDP 15 years ago. Now it has risen to 19%. So the total tax burden is increasing. So we consumers are not only paying a higher share of the total taxes, but also a much higher share of GDP as tax. What is more troubling for the middle class is how the share of income tax has gone up in the past 15 years. In the 2010-11, 15 years ago, income tax accounted for 27% of the direct taxes collected by the center and states. Corporate tax was more than double. It was about 59%. 15 years later, the share of income tax has risen to 48%, and that of corporate tax has dropped to 39%. So income tax, which used to be roughly 1/4 of direct taxes, has now risen to almost half, whereas corporate tax, which used to be almost 60%, a little less than down, is down to less than 40% now. The first time corporate tax dropped below income tax was in the COVID lockdown year, which was understandable because nothing was being produced, so how would you tax people? But now, even after the economy has recovered from its COVID lows, the share of corporate tax has not recovered. In fact, it has dropped even further. Now, mind you, these are taxes that you and I just cannot escape. We might say that we won't buy a car because GST is too high. But income tax is deducted at source. We cannot escape it. Your salary comes to your account after income tax has already been taken out and deposited. You and I can't do anything about it. And let me remind you again, this drop in the share of corporate tax and the rise in the share of income tax is happening at a time when salaries are absolutely stagnant, but corporate profits are at record highs. Data wonks who are watching this, you can look at it even from the perspective of, as I said, tax to GDP ratios. Income tax used to be 1.8% of GDP 15 years ago, right? Today, its share has doubled to 3.6%. What happened to corporate tax, on the other hand? It was 3.9% 15 years ago. Now it is down to 3%. Similarly, the taxes that consumers pay, the way I have calculated, was 10.7% or roughly about 11% of GDP in 2010-11. It has now risen to nearly 15%. taxes on producers, mostly corporates, was 5.7% 15 years ago. That has now dropped to just 3.7%. To come back to my original number, our tax burden has risen from 65% to 80% in 15 years, while that on producers, which is mostly corporates, has dropped from 35% to just 20%. So corporates have more cash in their hands, they're paying less taxes, and they're sitting on that cash. They're not investing. In fact, the finance minister herself has recently complained about that. And at the same time, we consumers don't have money to spend. Hopefully, the government is looking closely at these numbers and things will change. That is all we, the middle class, caught in the middle as we are, can hope for right now. Again, before I go, a reminder, if you want more of this kind of data-driven videos, become members of the Quint. It is easy. Just scan the QR code on your screen, choose a membership plan, and support us. Help us to keep the media independent. See you next time.